Welcome back to the Pirate Republic. This is an audiobook presentation of Pirates of the Wild West, the first novel in the Storm of Time series, released one chapter at a time. If you're enjoying this story and would like to support the podcast, you can join the crew on Patreon at the Pirate Republic. Physical copies of the book are available on Amazon and through traditional bookstores, and signed copies can be found on my website, briancantrell.com. Before we continue, a quick word of where we left off. The last chapter, Blackbeard and the surviving pirate captains awoke to a world that made no sense. The storm that tore them from Nassau Harbor did not leave wreckage. It left questions. The stars were wrong. The sea was much colder than it was in the Caribbean, and whatever had claimed them was not finished. What began as survival was fast becoming something else entirely. With the storm behind them and no familiar horizon in sight, the pirates are about to learn that they are no longer alone and no longer anonymous. This is Chapter 3, Legends. Chapter 3, Legends. Brightly lit by gas lamps and chandeliers, the main room of the Paris was a feast for the eyes. A large, polished wood bar dominated the left-hand side of the room, with a mirror extending its entire length, doubling the images of the multitude of bottles filled with various spirits that lined the shelves. A large, indigenous man with long braids in his hair poured glasses of amber-colored whiskey for the patrons and waitresses. He moved with efficiency, never cracking his stone-faced expression as people shouted their drink orders to him. The crowded hall was bustling with energy as cowboys, miners, gamblers, and thieves indulged themselves in the entertainment the Paris provided. A corner stage featured a piano man hammering out an upbeat tune while three women in colorful dresses danced. Several men stood at the edge of the stage and whistled and hollered whenever the women would hike their dresses to kick their legs in unison. There were tables crowded with gamblers, drinks in one hand, and a fistful of cards in the other. Pretty young women moved through the crowds in dresses and petticoats, delivering drinks, offering quick dances, and engaging the patrons in laughter and merriment. A staircase in the rear of the hall led up to the second floor that featured a long hallway balcony with a multitude of doors. Several of the doors were open, with views of decorated rooms with four-poster beds and clawfoot tubs. A man and woman were sharing an intimate kiss in one of the doorways until they passionately moved inside, and the man shut the door behind them with his boot heel, never interrupting the embrace. Philip Edward Albert was intently watching the cards that were being dealt around the table. He glanced briefly into the eyes of the dealer Colette Dallaire, who was also the proprietor of this establishment. Her pale, piercing eyes bored deep into his own as she seemed to dare him to continue his task of counting cards. He felt his face flush and with great effort turned from her and began watching the cards again. This was his second night playing Colette's unique game of 21. She had delighted him with the story of how she had learned to play the game from her Choctaw Indian abductors when she was just a young girl. The tribe had raided ranches and farmhouses, kidnapping young women to sell back to their families. Colette had lived with them for years in semi-captivity, but eventually her family paid a ransom, and she was returned home. As it turned out, her family would later shun her, claiming she was a ruined woman and could not be properly married. It seemed those years of living with the Choctaw had brought out a wildness that didn't integrate well into the proper New Orleans society. Philip watched players around him take cards as he stayed the course with a 9 and a jack held in his delicate hand. His wife always complained that his were the hands of a woman, long, thin fingers with soft, pale skin. He had to concede that next to her large, plump digits, his would be considered dainty, but then so would most, unless one was a hardened farmhand from birth. Philip hadn't seen her in years, barely even writing at all these days. He had little desire to sail home to London. A chemist by trade, specializing in explosives, he had carved out a nice niche working with mining companies to blast away unwanted rock to get to the precious ore they sought. Here in San Francisco, there was no shortage of companies and individuals that needed his services, as the easy pickings of gold and silver had already been had. It took a lot of digging or blasting to get down to the precious metals hiding underneath tons of worthless stone, rock, and dirt these days. He watched as Miss Dallaire drew cards, turning over first a 3, then a 5 to end her hand with an 18. He was delighted by his win, though the 2 miners next to him in recently washed clothes slapped down their cards in disgust and vacated their seats in an angry huff, slamming empty glasses on the table. "Tough luck, boys, but don't let your luck get you down. Go have a drink at the bar on the house," Colette said as she gave a head nod to the large Choctaw bartender, and he nodded in return as the miners approached the bar. The bartender fisted 2 glasses and generously filled them with whiskey as they sat down. 2 smiling young women, as if on cue, approached the men and engaged them in conversation. "Well, don't you have everything rightly in hand?" Philip said as he watched the 2 young girls quickly turn the mood of the men. "I merely care that all my patrons leave remembering what a good time they had at the Paris." Philip watched as the men laid down more money on the bar to buy drinks for the women. He watched as the bartender filled the girls' glasses from a different bottle than the one he used for the men. "Your working girls are drinking a watered-down version of spirits," Philip said knowingly. "It would do no good to have them walking about without their wits all night," replied Colette. "Indeed," Philip started to say as the door opened and the most unusual-looking band of characters entered one by one. Colette turned toward the door to see what Philip's wide-eyed gaze was taking in. Charlotte de Barry was the first to enter. Her wild and dreadlocked hair swayed as her head swiveled to survey the room. Her embroidered coat was open, showcasing her African kukri blade with its jewel-ornamented hilt and a flintlock pistol strapped to her waistband. Charlotte's tan-colored eyes took in the scene as though she was a panther happening upon a watering hole where small animals had gathered to drink. She was followed by the raven-haired Sam Bellamy, Bart Roberts, Anne Bonny, Calico Jack Rackham, Mary Read Charles Vane, Henry Jennings, Benjamin Hornigold, and Black Caesar, who turned and waited as his captain entered in all his glory. The hall went quiet as, one by one, the patrons turned to take in the new arrivals. The music awkwardly stopped as the last of them entered, and the door closed. Edward Thatch's white teeth shone brightly in the midst of his bristly dark beard as his broad smile widened as he took in the saloon. The crowded bar seemed in awe of the group's grand attire, and the amount, as well as the antiquity of the pirates' armaments. Most men in the saloon would never have been seen with a sword on their side, not since the Civil War ended, that is. Now before them were 11 ornately dressed, sword-carrying pirates with out-of-date flintlock pistols crowding into the gambling hall. "I think I'm going to like this place," announced Thatch with a wide grin. "Let's drink." Colette recovered quickly and threw a look at the piano player and dancing girls, who immediately launched into a new tune. The rest of the bar slowly followed suit by going about their business, but keeping a wary eye on the strangely dressed newcomers. Bart Roberts, Bellamy, and Vane headed to the bar, while Rackham, Red, and Bonny took seats at one corner of a large table. The patrons, sitting on the far side of that table, hastily moved away as Thatch, de Barry, Jennings, Hornigold, and Black Caesar approached to sit. "A night at the Paris never ceases to astound," said Philip. "It's why you keep returning, Mr. Albert." Colette watched out of the corner of her eye as drinks were brought to the pirate table and the group began to break apart as a few went to watch, in curiosity, the entertainment on the stage. The others went to drink at the bar, inquiring about the variety of spirit bottles that lined the back counter. The one with the wild blue eyes and long black beard was standing now alongside another pirate with brown hair tied in a ponytail, his face framed by long sideburns. They conspired a moment after noticing her and the open seats at her table, then began to make their way over. "What sort of game have we?" Edward Thatch inquired as he noisily adjusted the seat to allow himself and all his armaments to sit in the chair. Hornigold sat in between Philip and Thatch, with one lone cowboy seated at the end of the table. The cowboy looked the men up and down, scooting his chair a bit further away. "It's called 21, said Colette as she expertly shuffled the cards. "You win by having the highest total number without going over 21. Hornigold looked around the table, noticing the U.S. banknotes that were stacked in front of the gamblers and Colette. "We don't have banknotes, but I have these." Hornigold pulled a few silver coins from a small bag at his hip. Where are these from? Asked Philip, reaching for one of the silver coins. Hornigold snatched them back before Philip could take one. Spain, though it be no business of yours. May I see one? To test the authenticity of the coin? Asked Colette with a hand extended. Hornigold flipped the coin in the air, which was caught deftly by Colette. She looked it over, turning it around, checking the sides and the weight. She then flipped it back into the air to be caught by Hornigold. About the size of our silver dollars, if you'll accept them as equal, said Colette, pushing a U.S. silver dollar across the table. Thatch picked up the dollar and hefted its weight. Aye, close enough. Then let's wager, gentlemen, Colette said. Philip and the cowboy sitting at the table pushed paper money in front of them. Hornigold and Thatch mimicked their move with coin, and Colette dealt out 2 cards to each and laid 2 in front of herself, with one queen showing and the other card face down. The cards with faces are worth 10, and the ace, Philip showed the ace in his hand to Thatch and Hornigold, is worth 11. Philip smirked at Colette over the ace in his hand. A kindly fellow Englishman is showing us his cards, Thatch, quipped Hornigold. I am English, London, and I show you because we are not in competition with each other, only with the dealer. Thatch looked at his cards, calculated, and looked around the table. What now? Would you like another card? Or are you happy with what you have? You can take as many as you want, but if your total is over 21 you lose, said Colette. I'm quite happy with what I have then, lass. What about you, dear sir? She asked Hornigold. Hornigold looked up in the air, calculating in his head. She has a 10, Philip said, and must take another card until she at least has 17, though we won't know until the end what the face-down card is worth. If you want to stay with what you have, she could possibly draw cards totaling over 21 and lose the game. Hornigold only frowned at him, still not comfortable with the little man's help. The longer you think, the older I get, Benjamin. Thatch sighed, leaning back in his chair to adjust the blunderbuss from his hip. Quiet, Thatch. I'm considering my choice. I'll take a card if these fancy pants ain't taken one, the cowboy said. Hornigold looked harshly at the man, noticing the drab nature of the man's clothing compared to him and his mates. He merely wore a pair of brown trousers and a whitish shirt underneath a vest made from sheep's wool. It's not your turn, Clayton, you know that, scolded Colette. Hornigold leaned over to see the other player's cards, with the cowboy pulling his close to his chest. Hornigold, please, Thatch bellowed. I'll take a card, Hornigold exclaimed. Colette pulled the top card from the deck, turning it over in front of Hornigold. The card was a 9. Hornigold paused in thought, then his face went slack. 24, he said with dismay. Truly unfortunate, said Philip. He then asked for another card, and Colette delivered a 5. Colette turned over another card for the cowboy, which was a 3. He then asked for another, and it was a 5, which elated the cowboy. 19, he exclaimed. Colette only smiled at him. Colette turned her card over, and a 7 sat next to the queen, making her hand a 17. May I see your hand, good sir? She asked Thatch. Thatch turned over a king and an ace, making 21. Beginner's luck, said Philip as Colette paid out the winners. What's with your get-up? Asked the cowboy named Clayton. It's obvious that they are actors, costumed for a performance at the opera house, answered Philip. Captains, privateers, pirates if you wish, but do not insult me, you little worm, Hornigold said, with a dagger quickly pulled and pressed against Philip's neck. Colette was wide-eyed and wary. Her hand reached under the table to a short-barreled rifle affixed underneath to a hook. She clandestinely pointed it at Hornigold. I meant no offense, my good man. Forgive me for my ignorance, Philip stuttered out, arching his neck so it wouldn't be pierced by Hornigold's blade. Oh, let the little man be, Benjamin. We do seem to be in a city with contrasting fashions, Thatch said, putting a hand on Hornigold's shoulder. Hornigold slowly pulled the dagger from Philip's neck and then expertly flipped the blade into the sheath on his belt. Philip rubbed his neck and looked at his hand, relieved to see that no blood had been drawn. Where exactly is this San Francisco located in relation to Nassau? Asked Thatch. Why, I haven't heard of Nassau before. Is that where you and your friends have traveled from? Colette said, as she eased her hand away from the hand cannon under the table. We were in the port of Nassau when a hurricane hit, and then got caught in the storm, blew us out of the harbor and beat the ship to kindling. When the storm passed, we ended up here, Hornigold said. Ha! Simplified the story a bit, Hornigold. Mind you never be the one to tell me life's tale. You want me to tell about the largest wave man has ever seen that you steered us over, Thatch, only to plunge the entire ship into a whirlpool that drug us to the bottom of the sea, half our crew dead and drowned, all of us trapped many leagues below the surface, then emerging, though not in the warm waters of the Caribbean, but in the ice-cold bay of God knows where, this, San Francisco, Hornigold ranted. Thatch looked at him and stroked his beard in thought. Philip stared at the bar where Sam Bellamy, Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, and Mary Reed were sharing a bottle of dark rum. He turned back to Thatch and looked over his garments. They were ornate, yes, but a bit worn, unlike a costume, authentic. He noticed that their clothing was damp and smelled of seawater. The blade that was held to his neck was genuine. Of that he was sure. The multitude of weapons arranged on these men were not props from an opera, but also authentic and deadly devices, albeit antiquated. Thatch? Hornigold? Edward Thatch? Philip said, staring at their weathered faces, looking them over carefully. That's right. You've heard our names before? Hornigold asked. Philip let out a chuckle that sounded like a cross between a laugh and the noise a frog would make. He looked at Colette, who just sat with a curious expression, and then at the cowboy, who was completely confused. Heard of you? Of course I've heard of you. Who hasn't heard stories of the pirates that ruled the Caribbean seas? Thatch slapped the back of Hornigold. See that? And you were about to stick your dagger in his throat. I still might if he doesn't answer where we are. Nowhere near Nassau, nowhere near the Caribbean, nor the Atlantic, Philip said, looking manically at each pirate. You're on the northern coast of the Pacific Ocean. Thatch and Hornigold looked at one another. Neither were ready to believe this little man, but the waters were vastly different from the Caribbean. Any sailor worth his salt could have seen that. This strange town they found themselves in was completely alien from any other that was near their usual ports of call. Thatch looked at the woman who was dealing cards. She was quite an attractive young creature, who he was sure had a weapon hidden underneath the table, as her hand had suspiciously gravitated there when Hornigold had held the blade to the little Englishman's throat. She was staring at them with curiosity and a bit of wariness. Thatch had already noticed that several men in the hall were armed with small-barrel pistols, the likes of which he had never seen before. The glowing lamps used to light the room were unique as well. "You've heard stories of these men? Back in England?" asked Colette. Philip was still staring in awe at Thatch and Hornigold. He turned and looked at the entire party that had entered the Paris along with them. His eyes took in again the authenticity of their dress and weapons, the way they moved and talked, the scars and wounds they bore, he now took notice of. These were not actors ready to put on a show in the newly opened San Francisco Opera House. Yes, I know all about them, but it's not possible. Edward Thatch and Benjamin Hornigold disappeared, along with the rest of the pirate captains of Nassau in 1718. Everyone knows their story. Miss Colette, you're from New Orleans. You must have heard of them. Their names are legend. Hornigold, Thatch can't say those names ring any bells, Colette said. Philip shook his head. Maybe not by the name Edward Thatch, but this man, Philip pointed at Thatch, this man is better known as Blackbeard. You've just heard Chapter 3 of Pirates of the Wild West. Next week, the consequences of their arrival ripple outward, beyond the ship, beyond the sea, and into history itself. If you'd like to support the show, find signed copies, or join the Pirate Republic newsletter, you'll find all the details in the show notes. Until next time, keep a weathered eye on the horizon.